On TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is talkTV.
A very good evening. I'm Rosie Wright. Welcome to a special programme. Tonight, investigating the murder of the BBC journalist and presenter Jill Dando. He's the only man ever to have stood trial for the murder of the 37-year-old. It's Barry George, now living as a free man in a small village in the west of Ireland, having been cleared at a retrial 15 years ago. In the new Netflix documentary to air later this month, George continues to insist he's innocent. The question is, who did kill her? Tonight, over the next 45 minutes, we're going to be investigating the case in detail with the help of our panel of experts, including detectives who worked on the inquiry, a BBC colleague of Jill's, and an eminent barrister who defended George in court. But first, let's just go back, start the programme by reminding ourselves of the much-loved Jill Dando and the terrible events of April the 26th in 1999.
She was the nation's sweetheart, a popular high-profile star of the small screen and a so-called girl next door.
Oh, it's all right for her.
Best known for hosting the travel programme Holiday, fronting BBC News.
Good evening.
And for helping solve some of the country's biggest cases as the presenter of Crime Watch.
Good evening and welcome as people all over the country are joining together once again to solve some of Britain's most difficult and serious crimes.
But Jill Dando's own brutal murder remains unsolved. On the 26th of April 1999, at the height of her career, the 37-year-old had been out shopping, having spent the night before at her fiancé Alan Farthing's. At 11:30 a.m, after heading back home, she was gunned down in broad daylight. Despite attempts to save her at the scene and at Charing Cross Hospital, she was declared dead at 1 p.m. Minutes later, newsreader Jenny Bond, a friend and colleague, announced her death live on air.
Within the past few minutes, police have confirmed that the BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been stabbed to death outside her West London home.
Tributes followed from the Queen, the Prime Minister and many other public figures, while messages from the public poured into the BBC at a staggering rate of 1 every 2 seconds. The horrifying murder of one of Britain's most beloved presenters shocked and gripped the nation and sparked the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. But Jill Dando's murder remains a mystery.
Jill with something else.
Struggling away, hello.
24 years on, Jill's murder still provokes such an emotional response. Joining me now to discuss the nationwide shock sparked by her death is the journalist and Jill's former BBC colleague, who we just saw there, Jenny Bond, who had to read the news of her murder that day. Jenny, good evening. Take us back to that day in the newsroom, one I'm sure you'll never forget.
No, you're right. I absolutely won't. It was a lovely day. It was a spring day, I remember, and I'd gone in, perhaps as you saw there, rather a spring suit, very light blue. The day was progressing in quite a boring fashion, I think, actually, when suddenly the newsroom, which is such a vibrant, noisy place, you will know there's always a buzz going on and people talking, it went incredibly quiet and people started whispering. And they said, there's been a shooting and people are saying it's Jill. And no one could believe it. We just couldn't believe it. It was too much to take in. Jill had been so vibrant, so alive, who was due in, I think, later that day. And we didn't go straight ahead with the news. We were absolutely determined. Didn't matter what other news organisations were doing. We were not going to broadcast that news until it was utterly confirmed that her nearest and dearest had been told, her brother Nigel, her father, Alan Farthing, her fiancé, of course. So I don't think we were the first to broadcast the news, but that absolutely didn't matter. Right. And it fell to me to make that announcement. My bosses came up to me and said, "Are you okay? Can you do it?" I said, "Yeah, I can do it." I'd done Diana's death. And so we broadcast it, but the sadness in the newsroom was, well, it was, of course it was sad. It was utter shock.
Mm. And then just talk us through the weeks and the days that followed after you've made that announcement. Some of the details become clear, but also the BBC itself is getting, from my understanding, and tell us what happened, first of all, messages from the public sharing in the horror, like you and your colleagues, but also some really quite nefarious messages coming in too.
I wasn't part of what went on after that. You know, I was the royal correspondent and part-time newsreader, so I wasn't aware of the comments that were all coming, and all I knew is that the outpouring of love and affection for Jill, because, you know, I wasn't a bosom buddy of Jill's. I was a work colleague. We didn't socialise much outside the newsroom, although she did used to take me to a certain fashion house, because probably people imagine that when you read the news on telly, you get some kind of amazing dress allowance. There's no allowance whatsoever. And so Jill and I used to go to this fashion house, and they would lend us suits. I don't know if it was allowed or not, but anyway, they lent us lots of suits. So we go along there. And she was just so natural and so lovely that, yes, there was an outpouring from the public. And all I saw coming in were messages of enormous sadness and support.
Yeah. We've seen sort of some of the vibrancy just from even those very brief clips that we had there, her real charm and charisma and how she could connect with people. For them,
yeah, I think of her every day, actually. I think of her every day well, not every day, when I'm coming on telly or something like this, and I sort of do my hair. And I always remember Jill coming to the makeup room and said, "Oh, look at your hair. It's all too clumpy. Look, you need some wax. You need a bit of wax," and she'd help me to sort of separate it. And I still do that to this day. And so practically every day I still think of her. And, you know, that was a measure of how generous she was, because ours is quite a bitchy industry, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of jealousy, very inflated egos. And despite her enormous fame, so famous that on the day she died, the Queen paid tribute, the Home Secretary paid tribute. Despite all of that and her huge success, she was so down to earth and so charming. I know people say that all the time, you know, she was the girl next door. Well, I can tell you, she really and truly was.
Yeah, and it sounds like as a colleague and not a competitor, you've obviously got the absolute authority to say that. Final thing, Jenny, you know, in newsrooms, we're used to following the development of a story. How painful was it? Painful was it when you realised there isn't going to be a resolution quickly to be able to try and help at least, let's say, her family's grief?
Yeah, it was clear that this was very murky, and it continued and continues to be so. It's funny how you picture things, don't you, all the time? And I can picture exactly where I was in this house, actually hanging out the washing, when I heard that the guy who'd been convicted of her killing had, in fact, been Barry George. He had been that had been quashed. So every part of that journey is imprinted on my mind. And yes, it's been interesting to take part in this documentary that's going to be coming out, and whether we'll ever get to the bottom of who actually did this terrible, terrible thing to such a gorgeous, gorgeous girl. I don't know if we'll ever know.
Jenny Bond, thank you so much. Former colleague of Jill Dando. Joining me now to discuss the sort of nationwide shock sparked by her death, and, as Jenny just said, will we ever know what happened? Someone who was there on the night, former Met Police Paul Settle, who was on the murder squad the night of her death, is in the studio with me. Paul, good evening. Good evening. Take me back. We've heard from Jenny's perspective how that day unfolded. From your perspective, sitting with your colleagues, what happened?
I was on the murder squad at the time, and we'd been given another murder that had happened on the Friday night, early hours of the Saturday morning. So over the weekend, we'd been gainfully employed, very long hours, very, very impactful work. And we were just kind of recovering from that, having got the suspects in custody. And it was the early morning, and we started to get rumours that Jill had been shot. The thing was, we all knew her because we were just down the road. Murder was our thing, so it was not uncommon for us to be on Crime Watch.
Which, of course, she co-presented.
She co-presented, and we knew her, and she's a beautiful person. And the rumours were sadly confirmed not very long afterwards, and it was all hands to the pumps, and we went down and assisted with the house-to-house initial inquiries on the first night. I say thankfully, because murder's a horrible thing regardless. We kept with our original investigation, and Mr Campbell's team took on the Jill Dando investigation and saw it through.
So you were part of the sort of the literal very initial stages of gathering as much evidence as possible from people who were on her road, around the surrounding areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that sadly was to the detriment of the investigation was when Jill was shot, there were that many people that recognised it was Jill. They tried to help. So the ambulance service, for argument's sake, called somebody else down, and then called a supervisor down, and then somebody else. So around that capture of evidence at the scene, a lot of it was arguably lost from the outset because so many people had tried to help, when the reality was very sadly that first shot was fatal and there was no hope of saving her.
Yeah. What do we actually know? What concrete evidence is there that the police managed to investigate, ascertain, that we can say is fact?
So what we can say is fact is that the weapon used was a blank firing converted gun. Now, what is unique about these is that a blank firing gun needs to have no integrity on the barrel, where every other gun, everything is about the barrel's integrity. So the issue being it can only be fired once. So when that weapon is discharged once, there is as good a chance of that exploding in somebody's hand as there is of it delivering a fatal shot. It's not a hitman's weapon of choice. The bullet was handmade, and the cartridge that was recovered had very unique marks that showed it had been made. So the gunpowder, for example, was as unique as a fingerprint, and we established that it was a blank firing weapon that had done this, which in itself is unusual, because if a hitman or a contract killer had been involved, having dealt with numerous ones of those, very often they would ask for a specific weapon and so many rounds, a means of getting away, or a mode of getting away, and none of that was evident at all. What we do know is that she was found slumped in her doorway by a neighbour, and then after that, that's pretty much it. Nobody was seen doing the shot. Nobody was seen purposely running away from there, although people were seen running in the near street.
Yeah.
Can you connect them? We don't know.
But you've hinted there at sort of what the evidence suggests in terms of theories that then came next. Paul, hold there, because we're going to explore some of them in just a moment. We'll be looking at how, and Jenny mentioned this, having to break the news of it, Barry George, we can see pictures of him there, that's him now, how at the time he became the prime suspect. We're going to be speaking to the top defence barrister who defended him. All of that to come next. Welcome back. Now, the public interest in the Jill Dando case was, at the time, enormous, as were the list of potential suspects. One person was convicted of her murder, only then, afterwards, to be acquitted. His name is Barry George. Well, talkTV has obtained this exclusive new footage of him now living in Ireland. Our correspondent, Holly Hudson, who's been looking at who this individual is and how he came to be the police's main suspect. A warning, there are flash pictures in the following images.
Officers leading the hunt say 5 people saw a well-dressed man near Jill Dando's flat about the time of her murder.
She was shot with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol.
The tributes here on the flowers echo the overriding reaction of shock that has met the news of Jill Dando's death.
The killing of Jill Dando left the Met facing one of its most complex, costly and high-profile murder cases ever. Such was the level of love for the presenter that detectives were overwhelmed by tens of thousands of pieces of information from well-meaning members of the public. It became the biggest police manhunt ever.
Jill Dando was much more than a colleague. She was everyone's friend. And now, as Jill helped others, we hope we can do the same for her.
Eventually, it would involve the taking of 2,400 statements, the tracing of 1,200 cars, and the investigation of 2,000 suspects. At the very bottom of the list of potential killers was one name, Barry George. He'd been named in a tip-off given to police the day after the murder, which referred to a mentally unstable man who lived just 500 yards from Jill's home.
When was the last time that you saw Jill Dando?
I have never seen Jill Dando in the flesh.
George had been described by some Fulham residents as the local weirdo. But he was much more sinister than that. George had previous convictions for attempted rape and indecent assault in 1982. In 1983, he was found hiding in the bushes at Kensington Palace, wearing khaki, carrying a knife and a length of rope. He told police he'd been waiting for Princess Diana and was detained but never charged. George was a fantasist who had falsely claimed to be named Paul Gadd, real name of Gary Glitter or Barry Bulsara, the cousin of Queen singer Freddie Mercury. When police eventually searched his flat, they found dozens of photographs of local women. George, who once worked as a messenger at the BBC, also had 4 copies of the Jill Dando memorial issue of the corporation's in-house magazine Ariel. Infamously, they recovered this photograph of George posing in a gas mask while holding a starting pistol. Detectives were convinced they had their man when a forensic scientist said he'd found a particle of what could have been firearms residue from the gun used to kill Jill Dando. At his trial, George's only alibi was that he couldn't have murdered Jill because he was stalking another woman elsewhere in Fulham. On July 2nd, 2001, George was found guilty by a 10-1 majority jury verdict and sentenced to life in prison. But doubts remained over his ability to carry out such a well-planned execution. In 2007, his conviction was quashed on appeal, and the following year he was cleared on a retrial after the firearms residue was dismissed.
Serving 8 years in prison for someone else's crime is not acceptable.
George was also denied compensation for unlawful conviction because he'd lied to police. He continues to protest his innocence.
Everything was taken away from this man when the police started what we believe to be a malicious prosecution.
George now spends his days living in the west of Ireland. As you can see from this picture of him, as one Irish villager told us, he shuffles around looking harmless, but everyone knows what a disturbing past he's had.
Did you kill Jill Dando?
Still with me is Paul Settle, a former detective who was on the murder squad that responded on the night of Jill Dando's killing. And I'm also joined now down the line by Michael Mansfield-Casey, who represented Barry George in court at that original trial. Michael, thank you very much for your time. We've heard there from Barry George's family in Holly's report saying that he'd been, this had been malicious, that he was innocent. What was your analysis and your perspective in deciding you take on this case?
Well, that doesn't affect the decision to take on the case. My approach to the case had developed as I saw the evidence and all the rest of it. So one doesn't, at the beginning, all cases are equal to some extent, and that's not the factor. In other words, that what I think about it at that stage is irrelevant. Now, what I don't know whether you can afford me the time, but I really want to tell a rather different narrative than the one you've described so far. And I'm telling this because you begin to see why this was such an unreliable and unsafe conviction. First of all, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes to do this because it's extremely important to set the scene here. And these are facts. They're not speculation at all. First point, Jill Dando did not live at that house at number 29, Gowan Avenue.
She owned that property, we believe, and she was staying at her fiancé's house that evening. Yeah, okay.
Well, and other evenings. She hadn't been there the day before, nor the day before that. And this is very important as the beginning of the different narrative, because you have to know, if she's not living there, when she's going to visit. Now, when she's going to visit, second point, was unknown and unpredictable, because she'd only go there in order to retrieve mail that had come through the letterbox. The house was on the market to be sold. So that's the second point. How would you know when someone was coming? Third point, you've just seen shots of the road, Gowan Avenue, an impossibility to park outside. It's a very narrow street. You can see the shots of it now. At the time, it will be almost impossible to turn up at an unspecified hour and find a parking space right outside. So that's the third point, a parking space for her BMW right outside. Now, you will see on these shots here that the distance between the BMW she was driving and the front door, there we are, is very short indeed. So if somebody, and somebody did, if somebody is going to, as it were, wait in the vicinity for an unspecified amount of time, not knowing when she's going to come or if she's going to come, they have about a minute between her closing the driver's door of the BMW and walking to the front door. So the person who's going to do this has to be super ready and out of sight from her and everybody else.
Michael, the case that you're painting is that this was a professional assassination. In the studio with me is... So tell me what your theory is instead.
I haven't said that yet. It's very interesting you've come up with that conclusion. No. I'm only describing the facts. I haven't said that. You said that.
Sorry, Michael, all I'm doing that is because I'm aware of time. So tell me, based on the facts that you've laid out, what conclusions did you come to, if you did have a theory as to what happened that evening?
Yes, it's a theory, and I'm very unhappy about going straight to theories, because those who are watching like to know, how on earth does he arrive at this conclusion? So I'm setting out the steps that you have to take to get to the conclusion, that and the suggestion that was made in the trial, that for somebody to have done this, they have had to have known a great deal of information and had to have been in the right place at the right time. And I haven't even got to what happened in the doorway. This assassination took place with a gun very close. They'd have to know very close to, and one shot at the side of, because whether the gun would explode or not, one shot. Now, and then has to escape without being seen. So the full picture, without me saying a word about what I think it is, spells it out. It's called in court legalese, res ipsa loquitur. The facts speak for themselves. And that's why, juxtaposed with the person who'd been portrayed vividly in the press before and since and tonight, is not somebody who is going to be in a position to carry out that. And furthermore, people were seen leaving, not running, but leaving. The next door neighbor didn't identify him. The one over the road, I've got all the names, so I won't use them. Yeah. They didn't identify him either. Bullet cartridge case left in the doorway. What did it show? Yes, crimped, homemade. Mr. George had no equipment for doing any of this. It was made, if it was made anywhere, it was made behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, where crimped bullets were commonplace. So you put all this together and it's a very different picture.
Yeah, Michael, and I'm so sorry, but briefly, just for time, what alibi did you put forward then?
Well, it's very interesting. Where did you get the theory that he put forward any alibi?
Well, I'm asking you, did you?
No, you did in the run-up. You said he had an alibi and that he was stalking somebody else. That wasn't the defence. We didn't put that forward. He didn't actually give evidence in the trial in which I was concerned. So please be careful. That's not what he was saying.
We are trying to be careful and interrogate some of the evidence. Michael, thank you so much. Just hold right there. In the studio with me is still Paul. When that defence comes up to court, and look, he was found initially guilty and then acquitted, not guilty of this. How do you look at all the different sort of lines of argument that have been put up there about why it was initially that he became a suspect?
Well, to start off with, Mr Mansfield makes correct observation about right time at the right place, etc. But we have no idea whether or not he was stalking her for 2 weeks before. We don't know. The fact that it wasn't reported doesn't mean it didn't happen. At the same time, you look at the firearms evidence and the one cartridge recovered and the fact that it was a blank firing gun that was converted. It's London, it's busy, there are bangs. Just because somebody's not noticed something doesn't mean it didn't happen. So you know, people running away. I've found through bitter experience that if people act suspiciously, people tend to notice them far more readily. If you've just walked away or made haste away, it's a London thoroughfare. People are going to be going about their business. And she was found already deceased by a neighbour who noticed her slumped in her doorway. Nobody's heard the shot, nobody's seen it, nobody's actually seen the person running away. They've seen people that they're able to give a description of, but nobody can say that person there.
Michael's still with us. Michael, clearly, I mean, huge frustration from you, and I'm sure Barry George at the time, that you didn't initially get the verdict that you were arguing for. What kind of did you have conversations with Barry George when later on that retrial he then was proved innocent?
I'm not understanding your question. Did I have conversations with who?
With your client when he was no longer your client, when you then found out that on this retrial he's been acquitted?
No.
No, you didn't speak to him at that point?
No.
No.
No, I represented him on the trial and the appeal, but not the second trial because I couldn't do it. Another barrister called Bill Clegg did represent him on the second one. And it was on the second one that this particle was regarded as inadmissible and irrelevant because it was one particle. It's the kind of thing we were saying in the first trial.
Yeah.
So it's a very different situation, but I wouldn't have had contact with him there. And as far as I know, I haven't spoken to him since that time at all.
Yeah. Michael Mansfield, thank you so much, Casey, and barrister to Barry George, who's just laid out very clearly exactly when and when they didn't have contact. Also in the studio with me, DC Paul Settle, former detective who worked on the case and was part of the murder squad that evening. Next, this raises so many questions. Both of my guests have done that. Theories. Who was behind the 37-year-old's murder? Why have the Met never arrested any other suspect in the case? We look at all those questions next.
Good evening, I'm Piers Morgan, uncensored in New York City.
Yeah.
King Piers and King Q.
I think there's only room for one king, man. You know what I'm saying?
He's mocked your weight, Trump.
Yeah, look at him. Fail. Stop working.
Just because they're skin folk don't mean they're kin folk.
Do you believe you can win this war?
He's making me cry again.
They're trying to force you out. Yes, I feel betrayed.
Keep it award-winning. Mwah.
Lucy Letby will die behind bars.
And a senior doctor who first raised concerns about Letby wants NHS managers to be regulated.
We needed answers a lot sooner. This is, what, 7 years down the line? I mean, it's completely ludicrous.
We need accountability, we need performance in all walks of life.
If this nurse had misgendered somebody on a ward, she'd have been out the door.
When they first got together, there were press stories, weighty Katie.
That would make her a better Princess of Wales.
Ghislaine Maxwell agreed to be interviewed for the very first time.
I honestly wish I'd never met him.
Donald Trump has just said he expects to be arrested at 7:30 p.m.
The Conservative Party can certainly win the next election.
Can we?
Yes.
Labour are 29 points ahead in the polls. Can we?
Did he say, yes, I have taken drugs and they bent the rules, or lied on the visa application form and therefore got it?
There needs to be an intervention around abortion laws.
Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can determine these things.
The rest of the world has watched on in sort of mounting horror as this story has unravelled. For you, it was incredibly personal.
The death toll from the Titanic tragedy has risen to 1,522, and may God rest their souls.
Let it roll.
If we stop producing oil, the knock-on effect is far larger than just CO2.
I nearly have empathy when I'm speaking to them. I know now you're probably going to boot me off the show after saying this now. Oh,
Get her out.
Markle, about Meghan Markle. Some of them, they're easily led.
You can kiss my American ass. Thank you very much. Very nice of you.
Twitter, you sons of... Can you please reinstate my account?
Yeah,
Thank you.
There's a threat that you'd be worried about.
So are you saying that you're being overwhelmed, that you're inundated? We are really working hard for you. We're just asking patients to be patient with us.
We're now in Barbie world. You weren't asked to give evidence to the grand jury.
I'm the only one that has been telling the truth.
You don't drink, never taken drugs. You're stinking rich. Should we be concerned, Prime Minister?
If it's on your mind, it's on talkTV.
Is about you and your opinions.
If you're thinking about it,
We're talking about it.
It's all about me. That was a joke.
This is talkTV.
Welcome back. You're watching our special programme investigating the murder of Jill Dando. The acquittal of Barry George in 2008 left police searching for a new suspect. Although respected criminal profiler Dr. Adrian West had insisted the killer was a lone actor. Detectives also probed whether the motive might have come from Jill's private life, her work life for the BBC, or further afield. Holly Hudson looks at the theories.
And you just said you've never met your family.
Never, ever in my entire life.
Barry George is unlikely to ever again stand trial for the murder of Jill Dando. But a number of theories remain about who may have killed Jill and why. Top of those has been the suggestion it was carried out by a Serbian hitman. 2 days before she was killed, a NATO missile had hit the Belgrade headquarters of Radio Television Serbia. The BBC's head of news, Tony Hall, had also been the subject of a telephone death threat by a man with what sounded like an Eastern European accent. Police dismissed it as a hoax call, but MI5 and MI6 officers were nevertheless drawn into the Operation Oxborough police inquiry. The Serbian connection has been regularly dismissed by prosecutors, police and security sources. They argue that if Jill's murder had been a politically motivated revenge killing, why had there been no credible public claim of responsibility?
Good evening.
Jill's work on Crime Watch also led to a theory that she'd been targeted by an underworld gang.
If there's any way that you think you can help, please, please do.
For Jill's Crime Watch co-presenter Nick Ross, the police's original investigation came closest to finding the right man. On his website, Nick writes, while Barry George is unequivocally not guilty in law, it would be a falsehood to suggest there was never any real evidence against him. It would be an insult to the police inquiry, to the CPS, to the Treasury solicitor who prosecuted the case, to the first jury which convicted him, and to the multitude of coincidences that made him such a compelling suspect.
Clearly, many theories, but obviously no answers. For more on this, I'm joined now by the former Met Police Detective Peter Blexley in the studio and down the line criminal psychologist Dr. David Holmes. Peter, I'll start with you. We've just heard Holly lay out some of the theories that were investigated at the time for you, and we've heard from the murder squad working on the evening of the murder. The actual physical evidence was quite short. What convinced you the most? What do you think is most compelling?
The sad and rather unpalatable fact of this case is that we will probably never see anybody brought to justice for this crime. And the blame for that lies squarely with the Metropolitan Police. Don't listen to all this, we've taken thousands of statements and we've interviewed so many people and we've done so many actions. The fact of the matter is, when they searched Barry George's house, everything that they scooped up from those premises were thrown into bags in a pretty haphazard kind of way. Then, when the coat, which was the subject of the finding of the particle of firearms residue, was eventually examined, and they thought, oh, this looks a bit similar perhaps to some description that we've heard from a witness, that was put onto a mannequin in a room where many other items of clothing from many, many cases involving guns had also been photographed and stored. And it was only after it had been put on the mannequin, photographed, that then it was sent for forensic examination. Yeah. So that was flawed.
Yeah, I can't speak to the integrity of the police's investigation at the time. We know they had a suspect found guilty, then acquitted, and then as of 2014, the investigation is now just inactive. From your experience, Peter, when it's been, in this case now, 24 years on from the murder, do cases like this ever get solved?
Well, yes, old cases do get solved. And in fact, a couple of months ago, I was at Newcastle Crown Court to see David Boyd sentenced for the 1992 murder of 7-year-old Nicky Allen. So some 31 years after he'd committed that crime, that in large was solved due to new forensic evidence and the persistence of Nicky's mum making the police do their job. But so it does happen. Some cases do get resolved years and years later. I think this now, sadly, is one that is going to forever remain a tragic and sadly unsolved case.
We've got a response actually from the Met Police. I'd like to show it to you. He said that her death sparked, the police said, her death sparked the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. It became the biggest police manhunt ever. They say detectives were overwhelmed by tens of thousands of pieces of information from members of the public. And on the 100th day of the police investigation, we know, the public and the kind of scale of the search was vast. The Sun newspaper offered a £100,000 reward for information leading directly to a conviction. That the scale of the investigation clearly was significant. Let's speak now to Dr. David Holmes, criminal psychologist. David, one of the theories that Holly was talking about in her report there is necessary, maybe related to the work she was doing on Crime Watch. And, would it be, from your perspective of the type of person who commits a crime like this, and we don't know who that individual is, would it be someone with a vendetta who's out to seek revenge because they feel like she's exposed me and I've got to get my own back?
I doubt very much whether it be an individual who would be the one who carried out the crime. I would imagine that the person who carried out the crime is someone who's carried out this kind of crime before many times and would be working on behalf of some kind of Mr. Big, if you like, either in the UK criminal fraternity, someone with quite a lot of clout as such, and someone who is not going to actually reach out and claim responsibility. However, it is equally possible that this may have been someone working for Serbian authorities or Serbian groups who was perhaps a sleeper in this country and was very adept at perhaps tapping phones, etc., and finding out exactly when Jill Dando was going to arrive at home.
David, looking at the case, do you have a perspective, any kind of idea on the type of individual who would have done something like this?
Looking at the aspects of what actually happened on the doorstep, etc., yes, it looks like a professional killer. It's professional killing. The way it was carried out, the way the gun was held to the temple in order to muffle it, as well as make sure no blood splatter went around and make certain that she died instantly. This kind of thing points to a professional killer. However, someone who was, say, a stalker, who was absolutely obsessed and enraged, and perhaps someone who was adept at dressing up or impersonating, as was Barry George, other individuals or official individuals would perhaps act in a similar manner, having looked it up, etc. But it's going to be a difficult one. I do oscillate between the kind of enraged local stalker and the professional hitman from abroad. But the idea of the method that was used and the outcome, i.e., that there was no trace, just one person walking away calmly. I couldn't imagine someone of the stalking variety who would not have wanted to actually protract the situation, make more of it. This was an instant kill and get away. No interpersonal engagement, no enjoying the situation at all, but someone who just did the job and walked away quickly.
That's really interesting, the profile of kind of a stalker, that typically what they do in an instant like that. Peter's still in the studio with me. Peter, so many questions, and 24 years on, so many of those actually we don't have any answers to.
No, and cases are proven by evidence, not theories, not thoughts, not what a psychologist, not what a psychiatrist might think. And that's got the police in pretty hot water in the past as well. Yeah. If you remember the murder of Rachel Nickel, when as a result of a criminal psychologist, the police got obsessed about a man called Colin Stagg. He was charged and acquitted at the Old Bailey as well. It's evidence that is required. It's evidence that secures convictions. And frankly, at this moment in time, there is not sufficient evidence to put anybody on trial for Jill's tragic and horrific murder.
Yeah, the police have said, while the case has not been formally reopened and is therefore not subject to routine reviews, detectives would consider any new information provided to the Met to determine whether it represented a new and realistic line of inquiry. I think you've hinted at this already, Peter, but, you know, there's going to be a Netflix series that comes out investigating exactly this and looking at the timeline of what happened. When there is suddenly greater public interest in a case, presumably that might mean that just some new lead develops.
It might do, and I'm sure the Met will prop up a telephone number for anybody to ring if they watch that series and it prompts a memory, or somebody has a whisper to somebody else, and therefore there's a potential new line of inquiry to be followed. And I'm sure the Met will do that with all vigour, because they, like everybody who knew Jill only through our television screens, wanted to see this crime solved. And it was a real national disappointment that it wasn't.
Yeah. Peter, thank you so much. Peter Blexley, former Met Police detective, and speaking to me as well. Dr. David Holmes, criminal psychologist. Thank you both. Next tonight, what else happened today in the news? Annabel Denham and Mike Buckley will be joining me to discuss the other stories that have made headlines, including the shocking story that almost a third of female surgeons working for the NHS have reported sexual assaults, migrants attacking French police with weapons, and a TikToker showing his followers which are the best stalls to steal from. All of that's coming up next. welcome back. Now, Piers Morgan Uncensored is coming up at 8 p.m. with that exclusive interview with Luis Rubiales, so you will not want to miss that before, though it is Turbulent Tuesdays. And I'm joined in the studio by Annabelle Denham and also Mike Buckley. Let's kick off then. Annabelle, start us off. A pretty gruesome story and an awful headline.
Yes, indeed. Terrible story. This is the news that a third of female surgeons have reported sexual assault by a colleague, which is a staggering number. If you could imagine that in any other profession, people should be and are indeed rightly horrified to read about this. And of course, there's a threat to safety. There is all sorts of recruitment and retention challenges in the NHS, particularly among women and the specialties that they're choosing to go into. And so many will be deterred from going into surgery, having read about this. And I think, you know, it's coming off the back of the awful Lucy Letby story with those, you know, the tragic story about the babies who were murdered. You just have to wonder how rotten this institution now is and how they're going to root it out. How are they going to root out, you know, all of these bad eggs and ultimately fix an NHS that, to my mind at least, has been broken for a very long time.
Yeah, we should be clear, we're talking about surgeons here, and it is galling. I mean, many of them are reporting things happening in surgery. You know, you'd think if there was going to be a space where you'd be protected and immune for a situation like this. Mike, is it fair to cast such a sweeping sort of brush over the NHS as a whole being rotten?
I would be interested to see statistics in other parts of society, and I would be interested to see statistics in private healthcare as well, to see whether it is the NHS that is worse than other institutions, or to see whether this is actually, I mean, I hope this isn't a stat that is fairly common throughout society, but I don't have stats off the top of my head to tell you about how many women in society have experienced sexual assault and whether a third is an accurate number across in other sectors as well. I certainly hope it isn't. However, what we do know is that this is a horrible statistic and this needs to stop. In particular, thinking about hospitals and health settings, I think we all like to think that they are going to be safe environments for us, for our family members. People are often vulnerable in those environments, but obviously for staff as well. And as you say, we've got a retention problem anyway to do with overwork and low pay. This is only going to make it worse and encourage more GPs, surgeons, doctors, consultants to up sticks and move to the EU or move to Australia and move to New Zealand, where they can offer work fewer hours, possibly in safer conditions, we don't know, for a lot more money.
Let's move on to our next story, Mike.
Our next story is also not a great story. Shocking video shows Channel migrants attacking French officers, police officers, I presume, trying to stop their crossing with makeshift weapons and rocks. As the pair are now in the UK. They then crossed the Channel. They're now jailed after being detained at Dover. So what slightly confuses me about this is that if they'd claimed asylum here, presumably they wouldn't be in jail. Apparently they're not in jail for attacking the French police officers. So I don't quite know what happened, why they crossed the Channel if they're not going to claim asylum. But it certainly seems they need to be held to account for this behaviour, whether that's here or whether they're extradited to France to be held to account for it. And certainly looking at this, we can all but hope that this is not a common behaviour.
What I think is interesting is that, as far as I'm aware, they've been jailed because they didn't have valid entry clearance, but nor do the vast majority, or indeed any of the people who are coming across the Channel in small boats. And it strikes me that we're being a bit selective here. If indeed they're not being arrested because of the violence on the beaches of northern France, but rather because they made the crossing, then why is that applied to these two individuals?
But it's because it is illegal to approach the UK by sea in an unsanctioned vessel and then just land in the UK and go about your business for any purpose other than claiming asylum. If you land on the beach and you then claim asylum to the first official that you meet, you are then an asylum seeker and not a criminal. If you don't claim asylum, you are then a criminal and you are then put in prison and then deported, no doubt. So whether presumably these people didn't claim asylum, but it would seem odd to cross the Channel on a small boat and then not claim asylum. I don't understand why they did that. Clearly, there are things we don't know about this case. However, what we do know looking at that is that that was awful, and I certainly hope that the French officers are all right, and I hope these people are held to account.
Yeah, it plays into the problem that's still not solved by any means, and how you stop people attempting to make that journey in the first place. Let's move on. A story that I think just the last couple of weeks we've heard lots more about this type of crime.
That's right. We're being told by the Daily Mail that shoplifters are now using TikTok to tell fans how to steal. And this is, the sense that we have in Britain at the moment, that we have an epidemic of shoplifting. It's become, certainly in the last few years, an offence that is essentially decriminalised and perhaps triggered by a cost of living crisis, perhaps triggered by the fact that some criminals are doing this in a more organised manner. We're seeing a surge in the number of shoplifting, people who are shoplifting and incidences that are being reported by stores.
And not only that, then showing off about it afterwards.
Exactly.
With pride.
Yes, showing off about it and trying to offer tips, although I'm not sure advising people to do such things as wearing baggy clothing so you can fit items into it is especially groundbreaking stuff. But nonetheless, it seems to be something that one TikToker at least is bragging about.
Some stores are saying actually that wearing baggy clothes doesn't make any difference. People are just turning up with a rucksack brazenly in full view, putting things into their bag and walking out, and there's very little the shops can do. Mike, we were hearing this week that some major stores are banding together to have their own police force to say the current measures we've got in place aren't sufficient to stop people behaving like this.
Which is another indication that things are not working in this country. I mean, this is obviously, there's been so many stories about the police force, you know, with abuse in the police force, talking about abuse in surgery earlier on. We know there's been a lot of abuse in the police force. And of course, the Met has had so many scandals in the last year or two. But this is another example of the fact we should be able to rely on the police to turn up to a shop where there's been a shoplifter and do something about it. If that isn't the case, it's going back to the 1800s with people recruiting their own police forces. What is going on in this country? I mean, we know that 20,000 police officers have been cut since 2010. Those numbers have been going up. But I was talking to somebody who works in the police quite recently, and they were saying police force numbers are going up, but backroom staff are going down, so they've no extra capacity. So this government says they're fixing the problem, but they're not, as in that's being experienced by shops, of course.
They've also said they'd criminalise shoplifters in a more stringent way they have done and put them in prison, but that leads to another question.
But we know the prison service is a mess as well.
We're going to have to move on to our last final story. Mike.
Final story, cheery one, this one, or cheerier anyway. Prince Harry cheers on Invictus athletes ahead of Meghan's arrival. Maybe they're not related, I don't know. So this is the Invictus Games, which, to be honest, is one of the great things we can point to and say, yes, Harry was part of this. It's a really good thing. We're all quite proud of it, and it's maybe one of the few things we can be proud of Harry for. So it's great that it's happening. It's great he's put his energy. Oh, well, no, maybe not. Yeah, probably. It's a good thing. Let's celebrate it as a good thing, regardless of everything else that's happened in the last however many years it's been. You know, it's good that this is happening. It's good that it's happening for the people that it's happening for. And it's nice for him to have something positive. But maybe let's learn from this. I hope he learns from this. Focus your energies on something positive. Stop complaining about the past. We've all had bad things happen in our lives. We don't bang on about it for the next decade. Maybe it's time to move on for your sake, for your family's sake, for our sake as well.
Annabelle, in a sentence, what do you make of it?
I completely agree with you, Mike. I think that it's nice to see Harry hitting some positive headlines for a change. He needs to stop airing his dirty laundry. But I do feel as though Harry and Meghan are slipping into irrelevance here in the UK. He was in Britain recently, and
now the Invictus Games is time for a bit of a reputation change. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thanks for watching. Piers Morgan Uncensored is up next with that exclusive interview with Luis Rubiales. Thank you very much to my panel, Mike and Annabelle. I'll be back tomorrow. See you then.
It's the kiss that became a political crisis and a story that's divided the world. Luis Rubiales, Spain's Football Federation president, planted a smacker on the lips of Jenny Hermoso as they celebrated winning the World Cup. She says it wasn't consensual. He says it was, and his critics are idiots. And the storm that followed has dramatically overshadowed team success. As the criticism intensified, Rubiales issued an apology.
Y pues todo lo que ha ocurrido entre una jugadora y yo, tengo que disculparme, no queda otra, ¿no?
Spain's Prime Minister called it unacceptable. His deputy accused Rubiales of sexual aggression, claiming he represents the very worst of society. Protesters want to make this a Me Too moment.
Rubiales, dimite! El pueblo no te admite!
Exposing everyday sexism and workplace misogyny, with Rubiales as the poster boy. But despite mass calls for his resignation,
que las disculpas que ha dado el señor Rubiales no son suficientes.
Suspension by FIFA, now a criminal case against him, the top dog in Spanish football had, before this interview, simply refused to go.
No voy a dimitir. No voy a dimitir. No voy a dimitir.
Critics have made Rubiales a totem of toxic masculinity. Supporters say he's collateral damage in a culture war. Tonight, he has his say, and it's uncensored.
Good evening, I'm Piers Morgan, uncensored in New York City.
Yeah.
King Piers and King Q.
I think it's only room for one king, man. You know what I'm saying?
He's mocked your weight, Trump.
Yeah, look at him. Fail. Not working.
Just because they're skin folk don't mean they're kin folk.
Do you believe you can win this war?
He's making me cry again.
They're trying to force you out.
Yes, I feel betrayed.
Keep it award-winning. Mwah.
Lucy Letby will die behind bars.
And a senior doctor who first raised concerns about Letby wants NHS managers to be regulated.
We needed answers a lot sooner. This is, what, 7 years down the line? I mean, it's completely ludicrous.
We need accountability, we need performance in all walks of life.
If this nurse had misgendered somebody on a ward, she'd have been out the door.
When they first got together, there were press stories, weighty Katie.
That would make her a better Princess of Wales.
Ghislaine Maxwell agreed to be interviewed for the very first time.
I honestly wish I'd never met him.
Donald Trump has just said he expects to be arrested at 7:30 p.m.
The Conservative Party can certainly win the next election.
Can we?
Yes.
Labour
absolutely.
29 points ahead in the polls. Can we?
Did he say, yes, I have taken drugs and they bent the rules, or lied on the visa application form and therefore got it?
There needs to be an intervention around abortion laws.
Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can determine these things.
The rest of the world has watched on in sort of mounting horror as this story has unravelled. For you, it was incredibly personal.
The death toll from the Titanic tragedy has risen to 1,522, and may God rest their souls.
Let it roll.